My name is Christie Edwards. I am currently the head of the Tolerance and Non-Discrimination Department at the OSCE's Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, based in Warsaw, Poland. But I am honored to be here in my capacity as the co-chair of the International Organizations Interest Group for ASIL. But I also wanted to say a huge thanks to my co-chair Melinda and our former co-chair Bart for their assistance in putting this together. It's been a labor of love for the last couple of months in putting this together and organizing it. So thanks to both of them as well. I also wanted to note that this event is part of a new series that the IOIG has launched in 2019 to foster a community of staff at legal and programmatic offices of international organizations. And the aim of the initiative is to bring together IO staff lawyers to discuss common questions and recent developments in their field of practice. So with that, I will also then introduce Steve Hill with a huge thanks for joining us. He is the outgoing legal advisor and director of the Office of Legal Affairs at NATO Headquarters and a member of the ASIL Executive Council. And I will refrain from reading off more of his bio because that's a lot of what we're going to talk about this evening. It's evening our time and maybe lunchtime for many of you. But today, that's what we're going to cover much of. So Steve, maybe to start things off, could you talk about how you landed at NATO as a legal advisor and maybe a bit about your background and what other roles you've had in your career?
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Christy. Thanks, Jimmy, Ben, and thanks to the interest group. I'm actually really honored that so many people are interested in international organization careers. We really need a diverse group of good people to keep staffing these positions. And so thank you for your interest. I also need to make a disclaimer. This is my personal capacity. It's not a view of NATO or of any NATO allies. So how did I land at NATO as a legal advisor? Well, I mean, anytime you ask someone to describe their career, there's a lot of unpredictability to it. It's very easy to form a narrative in retrospect, but it's not so easy, and it seems almost paralyzingly difficult when you're trying to form it. And I think that's particularly the case in this world of international organizations, just because there are so many ways you can approach it. There's so many ways you can get into it. And so I think there's always a kind of a false narrative there, but let me try mine. So when I was in university and then in law school, I was kind of torn. I knew I wanted to do something involving foreign affairs and diplomacy. I didn't know whether I wanted to join the US Foreign Service. So in other words, don't become a lawyer, just work as a diplomat, or try to do something in more the international law space. The vagaries of the US budget decided that for me at the time because there was a hiring freeze in the Foreign Service. And so I thought that the best way to get into the State Department and Foreign Affairs would be through the legal advisor's office. I eagerly applied for an internship during my second year of law school in the US. I was rejected from that. So I thought to myself, gee, that's not a really great start. Luckily, I was able to get hired in third year during the hiring process there. Every year, as you may know, the Office of Legal Advisor at the State Department hires a few folks. I joined L, as it's called, in 2001. So my IO career started in the national government, and that's not the only way you can do it, of course, but it's definitely an important way. My first assignment in L, and maybe there's a lesson out of this too, came as a real curveball to me. It was in the real estate department of L. And so it was doing the real estate law of all of the US embassies and consulates and other kind of properties around the world. It wasn't what I thought I was going to be going into, public international law, but it ended up being probably one of the best jobs I've ever had. And it actually taught me so much that I've been using over the course of my career. I spent a couple of initial rotations in Washington. I took the chance to go work for almost a year at the American Embassy in Baghdad in Iraq in 2004. And that was kind of my first eye-opener towards what it's like to work directly with international organizations, because we had the UN mission there. We also had other IOs that were operating there. And I got to know some of those folks in the course of my time in Baghdad. I returned to Washington then, and I did another rotation in our IHL department, which is called Political Military Affairs, a lot of armed conflict, and then in our Human Rights and Refugees department. In that, I was doing a lot of multilateral work representing the US in different human rights bodies. In fact, the office also used to cover the OSCE human dimension, which is what I think you're working on, Christie. So I did that. I was doing a lot of multilateral work representing the US. And it was really interesting. I was working on the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I was working on the US's reports to the Geneva-based treaty bodies under the Convention Against Torture and under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So I had a lot of interface there. I would be sent up every fall to the third committee of the UN General Assembly as a national delegate. Through all those experiences, I got a chance to meet more and more people who were in this space, not just other state representatives, but also NGOs, folks like the ICRC, the people that worked in the UN Secretariat. And so that made me think once again, wow, I should look for an international organization job. My first real break in that regard came completely randomly. It came as the result of a conversation at a party where they were looking for people to staff a kind of startup international organization that was designed to support Kosovo during its, right after its declaration of independence in 2008. That was an international team, mostly North American, European, Turkey was part of it, and each of these states was on the hook to send some people to staff different parts of that organization. I was sent to staff the legal unit, and we were a kind of a multinational team that worked on essentially rule of law work with people, the authorities in Kosovo. So that was kind of a mixed. Of course, we were also the general counsels of the organization, so that was sort of a mixed legal, but also rule of law policy job, and maybe we come back to that in a minute. After spending a couple years in Kosovo, I spent a year in China, kind of a sabbatical. I wanted to learn more about China. And then I got a job at the US mission to the UN. So I was based there in New York. I spent a couple of years as part of a three lawyer team, working the 6th committee of the UN General Assembly, the legal committee, the Security Council, but also just working broadly with the UN system on a lot of different issues. It was in the middle of working there, a job that I absolutely loved, that this job at NATO came open, and I just applied for it, and it ended up working out. So that's how I ended up there. It sounds very coherent in retrospect, but it's not really. Didn't feel like that at the time.
I think that's often the case. Absolutely. So this is a question that I'm personally very interested in working for an international security organization myself. But could you tell us a bit more about what you found were the biggest challenges to working as a lawyer at NATO, particularly with the security issues that you worked with?
Yeah, well, I mean, part of it was timing. My first day on the job at NATO was right when the whole Crimea situation was unfolding, as the invasion was happening. And in fact, I had to turn up at a meeting on a Sunday of NATO's supreme, governing body. And I didn't even have a building pass. I had difficulty even knowing where to go. So I had to have someone meet me at the front door. So part of it was just the timing. That was a big challenge. Also, the fact that in IOs, you really have to do a lot with a very small number of people and a lean team. So I had a great team there in our Office of Legal Affairs, but it was very lean. So that's that's one challenge. They're just doing a lot with a small number of folks. Second, it was really, constantly being mindful of the need to transition from your national perspective, especially people like me who are coming out of the national system, to an international perspective. You really have to look inside yourself, question assumptions, make sure you're not falling victim to unconscious bias, all these kind of things. That was a really a big challenge to working at NATO. That's the second thing. The third thing was maybe just different conceptions of the role of lawyers. And so I was really, very lucky to come out of the State Department, where you had clients that generally welcomed lawyers, where lawyers were very much involved in policy processes, part of the clearances. You learn that that's not always the case, and there are different expectations of lawyers, different legal traditions. Not only with the clients, but also sometimes with the lawyers themselves. So that was probably the third challenge, is just kind of dealing with different conceptions of the role of a lawyer. And, just to be clear, my clients were wonderful in NATO and accepted me very much, but still there was a different kind of dynamic in dealing with that.
Sure. The national perspective certainly resonates. I came to the OSCE from an NGO background, and so having to make that shift from sort of the advocate role to working for an international organization, which has a very strictly defined role that it can play on many of these issues, even if you're talking about the same issues, was definitely a shift. So what would you say are the biggest challenges facing the NATO alliance today? And what do you think, or how do you think that lawyers play a role in maintaining its legitimacy?
So I guess three challenges. So the first one is just the changing security environment that NATO finds itself in. I mentioned already the Crimea, Ukraine situation, but also the rise of cyber attacks, hybrid warfare, the challenges in the Middle East, North Africa, the fight against Daesh, ISIL. I mean, it's a very difficult security environment at the moment in what we call the Euro-Atlantic space. So that's one thing. I mean, secondly, especially for NATO, but I think for all IOs, it's a challenge of adaptation. You've got these very old structures. NATO just celebrated its 70th anniversary last year. UN is celebrating 75 years. Yet we're not really creating, generally speaking, new IOs. We need to use existing organizations to do the work that needs to be done. And so this force of adaptation is really key. And then thirdly, it's a challenge, I think, in NATO, I guess also the OSCE, the challenge around consensus. So NATO is a consensus-based organization, and it's always challenging to get consensus. But I have a feeling that today, if you just combine the security environment with adaptation and with other factors, it makes it even harder to get consensus. So how does lawyers play a role in that, in maintaining legitimacy? I mean, I've always found it sounds almost cliched, but international law is the common language that we have. If you want to get states sitting down around the table, it's the language that they use to speak. It's the language that they use to formulate issues. It's the language that they use to build trust. And so first, I think, lawyers help just safeguard that language of legitimacy. I mean, of course, there's also within NATO, I mean, I think for everyone, international law compliance is really key towards legitimacy with our populations. And so, NATO was really at every turn, very transparent about complying with international law. Like I think about our cyber policy, for example. My boss, our Secretary General, is constantly articulating how NATO's cyber policy is in accordance with international law. And it sounds like almost a communications point, but it's not. It's very deep. And so lawyers can help support that. You can be an advocate for that. You're not the only advocate. Everybody's an advocate for that, but that's very important.
Absolutely. Maybe now going to a few more of the specific aspects of your role. Can you tell me what were the primary functions that you held as a legal advisor?
So, I mean, my main client was the Secretary General of NATO and the kind of senior management within the NATO organization. And so we have some assistant secretaries general who were responsible for different things. So my primary responsibility was to advise them. I would also say that it was, you're also part of the organization's team. So it's also that you are a leader in the organization, but you're also someone who is a booster and a supporter of the organization. So a lot of what I did was, on the maybe more prosaic end, sitting in a lot of different management meetings as we tried to figure out how to do, who knows what, how to update various policies, ranging from mundane to really interesting. So there was that, but also just being part of a group of people that was advocating for the alliance. So I did a lot of public diplomacy. I did a lot of legal diplomacy. We have now 30 allies in NATO. I would, consider that part of my role was reaching out to and understanding the concerns of those allies, both from the kind of foreign affairs side, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the diplomats, but also the defense folks and the armed forces. And so a lot of my role was external facing. I mean, of course, a lot of the role too, and it's often is not one of the first things that you think of when you think of international organizations. You also have to be a manager. And it's hard to manage sometimes. I mean, I had a wonderful team, but you have to spend time also managing. In addition to all that stuff, I had to do, things like negotiating, dealing with our host country, dealing with places where NATO was operating, Afghanistan, Kosovo, those kind of places, and try to work on that. So those are some of the things that I got a chance to do. And of course, you're helped by the whole team in doing those things.
Absolutely. My next question, we've touched on this a little bit, but how would you see serving as a legal officer for an international organization different from serving as a legal officer, a legal advisor for a government or in the private sector, or, from my perspective, obviously coming from an NGO, how do those roles differ?
Well, I think one thing is you may need to be much more of a generalist than you expected. Like my first job in the legal advisor's office at State was real estate. Then I was working in human rights. And so, you had to know a lot of different fields, but at any given time, you were only responsible for one slice of the pie, as it were. In IOs, it goes back to the point about the leanness of the legal offices. You may have to cover, lots of stuff. So I think of some of my colleagues who joined recently the NATO legal office, and they might handle from GDPR issues on the one hand to outer space issues, at the same time. So I think you need to probably have more of a generalist function than elsewhere. The other particularity is probably, the fact, maybe some people don't know it, but it's something that you need to embrace, is the fact that IO legal offices really are involved in the internal rules of these organizations. And so a lot of my work was what you could call the law of NATO. So, that ranges from kind of the structure of NATO and how does it work, but also the internal law of NATO. So human resources, procurement. IOs are always loath to submit themselves to national jurisdiction, and that means that you need to come up with your own policies, but they need to be somehow harmonized with whatever the right benchmark is. And so you have to spend a lot of time on internal rulemaking, and that's probably a bit different than private sector companies or governments.
Absolutely. And I know for many of my colleagues and folks that I've sort of come up through the ranks with, folks always, or oftentimes will spend a lot of time thinking about, do they want to go sort of the subject matter technical expert route or the management route, where you do have to have a much broader skill set, and also understanding like management skills, understanding the internal legal structures, which might not be in any way related to the area of law that you might have wanted to focus on in particular. Of course, hopefully you still get to do a bit of that. So maybe as a secondary point to the kinds of roles, what in your experience, or the kinds of tasks, what are the kinds of roles that lawyers can often do in an international organization?
Yeah, well, and I think this goes to the issue of how do you get your foot in the door in an international organization. I mean, there's always, at least I hope, there's always going to be a legal office that will be providing legal advice, usually to the management of the organization or the like the governing body of the organization. So there's that, but there are also quite a number of roles that you could also use legal skills, very well in. For example, rule of law and capacity building work. There's quite a lot of that out there. I also think that the work in the internal issues of an organization. So organizations now really need to adapt, as I said, and also modernize their internal rules and their regulations to be really fit for purpose. And that so much of that is the kind of work that lawyers do very well. Drafting, figuring out how to conceptualize a problem, figuring out how to do a process that will result in a good rulemaking. I think that's an area that lawyers, it's not very well known, but and that's often found in human resources or in the administration department. But I think that's a very important role for lawyers and IOs. Also, you tend to find, honestly, lawyers in all parts of international organizations, political officers, even sometimes, the really top echelons are lawyers by background or, are working. So I think it's a very good background. It's also probably from a career perspective, I would say, if you want to get your foot in the door, have a look at, beyond the legal office, because there are roles out there.
Absolutely. Programmatic offices frequently rely heavily on folks with a legal background. Absolutely. And maybe just a quick note to the audience, do be thinking of some questions. We've got plenty of time for Q&A at the end of our discussion. And I know some questions have already come in, but please feel free to shoot those over in the Q&A button down below if you like. So Steve, the next question I have for you is, how do legal advisors or lawyers in other capacities at IOs shape international law? And I know you've talked a bit about your background working in public diplomacy and legal diplomacy. So what would you say would be some of those shaping factors that you worked on?
Yeah, I still think that states are the ones that make international law. And so if you're in an IO, your role is generally to be a forum for states to, work on evolving international law. And so I know that's maybe it's an old school way of looking at it, but I think it's also realistic. And so, but that said, the fact that you can shape the forum, that you can influence the way in which the discussions take place. At NATO, for example, unlike the UN system, the Secretariat actually chairs working groups and committees and things like that, not the member states. And so there's a role in the way you kind of shape the questions. So there's a lot of that. One example from NATO, I think, is kind of the evolution of the international law of cyber operations or the international law in cyberspace. This is an area where, for one reason or another, there haven't been very many expressions of positions by states. States have been hesitant, and we see more and more states now saying how they think international law should apply in cyberspace. But one of the things that I think NATO did in that case was provide a forum that kind of nudged a little bit. But also NATO kind of provided a forum where, maybe non-state actors. So we had this Tallinn manual of the international law of cyberspace. That was not an official NATO doctrine, but that was under a process that was sponsored by one of the centers of excellence within the kind of NATO universe. That's kind of an example, I think, of how lawyers help shape international law. But, I think they do.
Absolutely. And I know many folks, as in some of the programmatic or technical spaces will often suggest draft language or, give expert advice on, what some of the legal parameters would be if states are looking at, one formation of language versus another. And they can very much participate in that conversation, even if they're not the ones, on the creation side. Sure.
Absolutely. And, obviously I'm sitting here in The Hague in the Netherlands, and I think of the whole cadre of folks that have gone through the tribunals here. That's an example really where you do shape, judicial decisions, at least in a way that's quite powerful. So
absolutely.
Another example.
Great. So what advice might you have for a lawyer who's interested in working in a legal capacity in an international organization?
Well, I said it before, but let me repeat it. You need to get your foot in the door somehow. And it's hard. It's very difficult, partly because of just the resource issues. There's not a lot of hiring. There's not, in general, kind of honors programs like you might have in national governments that are designed to bring young people into the system. That said, NATO, for example, just set up a young professionals program. So that I think there is a recognition that we need to get more young professionals into the system. But I think what it means for now is that you have to use your wits to get your foot in the door somehow. So that means you need to be flexible. It may, if you're already working in a law firm or whatever, it might mean a significant downgrade in salary or in, some sense of level or prestige. There are some ways that I advise people to do that. Because it's not always easy to get jobs in the headquarters of whatever organization you're at. I mean, one thing is field jobs. So I mentioned that I got my start, or I didn't get my start, but I got a very formative couple of experiences in Iraq and then in Kosovo. Oftentimes in the field, you can, just because sometimes the hiring is maybe a little more, improvised or who knows what, there's greater need. You can get a way in. I think a lot of people in my generation started their career in OSCE missions. I don't want to, I'm only just mentioning OSCE because you're working there, Christie, but I think a lot of the UN agencies have field presences, a lot like IOM, the International Organization of Migration. There's often, so if you're in a personal position where you can uproot yourself and go into a field job, I would seriously consider it. Let me just give one other piece of advice that is kind of something that's idiosyncratic about hiring at international organizations. There's been a broad move, I think, both of our organizations towards this competency-based hiring system. And it actually sometimes is dispiriting if you're someone like a lawyer where you really value the technical details of what you're doing and the expertise, because it's a way of generalizing skills into kind of some basic principles. And sometimes it's frustrating if you can't describe what you wrote in that law review article or in that student note, but rather you're supposed to talk about how you showed resilience or adaptability or whatever the competency is. But one thing that's good about competencies is that it's very transparent, or it makes it more transparent. So if there's a job that you're going for, say you want to be like a legal officer in the UN Office of Legal Affairs or whatever, you can find the job announcement for that. You can look at the competencies and then you can work your own career a little bit toward those competencies. Either by thinking about how you can conceptualize, your existing work within the context of those competencies, or how you can actually try to seek work that is responsive to those competencies. So I would say, make the competency-based system work for you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And I would maybe add just one thing for some of our American colleagues on the call today. While I know getting your foot in the door in international organizations can seem daunting for many of us who grew up in a monolingual school system, but some of the international organizations, the OSCE, for example, is an English based organization. So that can give you very much a leg up if you can, again, show those competencies very well in English. But I would also say, take a look at the US government's secondee program. Because they often will second American citizens to work for international organizations, the OSCE in particular, but I know others. And that's a good way to get your foot in the door than to make the shift over to international contracted positions. So I would just sort of say, keep an eye on those opportunities as well. So last question for me, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. But are there legal ethics that are particular to working as a legal advisor at an international organization, or to working with a security alliance in particular?
Yeah, from a formal perspective, there are some kind of regulatory instruments. So for the UN system, there's the standard of conduct. For the International Civil Service at NATO, we had a code of conduct. There are rules. And so, there are sources of law on ethics. Those of us who are I mean, my approach has been, I've always been a member of a bar. My approach has always been also to hold yourself to the standards of that particular bar. That's never caused me a particular problem, but that you could conceivably have different ethical standards there. And actually, I've had very interesting conversations with colleagues over the years about how they sometimes reconcile that. I think the main legal ethics issue in an IO is really goes back to what I said before. You really need to adopt an international outlook. You really need to internalize what your role is, which is, for example, in NATO, it was helping our Secretary General to achieve consensus of our 30 allies. And what can you do to, and try to take, your own kind of identity in a way out of the question. That's maybe more than an ethics issue. That's maybe more of a philosophical issue, but I think that's really something you need to always pay attention to in your career. And then finally, an ethics issue that I think happens in IOs a lot is because of the, because of the leanness of processes and because of the way, it's not a national government where you might have very established procedures on every single thing. Oftentimes, I find that the lawyers are the penultimate stage in a lot of processes. The last step, the last check, as it were, before it reaches the ultimate decision maker. And so you really need to, and this goes to the ethics of it as well, because you really need to be able to make sure that you're in a position to stand up and raise a red flag if you see something wrong. It's difficult because a lot of times, like always, legal is consulted at the very end of a humongous process that's taken a huge amount of work and is not always, it's not always welcome if legal asks questions. But I think you have to have the ethical fortitude to be able to do that, because if you're just kind of clearing things, I think you miss out on an important function that legal offices play in IOs.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. So I'm going to open up the chat box here and take a couple of questions. The first question is more on, I think, getting that foot in the door. Do people with a double degree, other than simply a law degree, have any advantage in international organizations? How about the need for or edge of a specialist degree in a sub area of public international law, say an LLM in human rights?
Well, I think it's a good question. It's hard to generalize. I think you have to look at, when you look at candidates, especially for sort of entry-level positions, I think the manager looks at the whole package. And so it's possible that you can use a specialist degree, like you're saying, an LLM in human rights or what have you, as kind of the way to broaden out your profile. But you could equally do that through, different kinds of jobs that you've had, different kinds of interests that you've had while in your primary degree. So I don't want to set down a hard and fast rule that, you need to have like 2 LLMs in addition to your law degree or whatever. I mean, to be honest, sometimes in hiring, you look for the person who sticks out for whatever reason. So one time I hired an amazing lawyer who ended up succeeding me in my job in the past because she had done her BA in fine arts, in art history. And I said, wow, I wonder why somebody involved in art history would want to be involved in what we're doing now. And so, that sort of got her out of the pile. And then look, she ended up taking over the whole place.
Very cool. And I think there's also, I would say, a strong argument. I mean, if you've got the LLM in human rights, that can be fantastic, particularly if you're applying for a human rights focused job. It can really show your expertise. But I think it goes back to that competency-based application process. You need to show how that law degree enhances your competency skills. And so often what I'm looking for when I'm hiring folks is, what skill sets do they bring to the table, and whether they have a background in fine arts, but they've done a ton of management and critical thinking and writing. I don't care if they have a degree in fine arts or math as their, general degree. If they've got the general competencies that I'm looking for, that's fine. So I think for candidates, particularly entry-level candidates, showing how your experience matches the job requirements or the technical requirements that the position is looking for will make it very easy for a manager to see why you would be the best candidate for the job. Okay, next question. Where do you see the major impact on NATO after the US withdrawal from the Open Skies Treaty?
Okay, now we go from
we're digging right
digging right into IO. Well, I think that the Open Skies Treaty is a very, first of all, it's a multilateral treaty that includes not just the U.S. but also a lot of NATO allies, and so NATO allies inherently have an interest in the Open Skies Treaty. I think they see value in it. So I think that it's up for each country to decide how they want to proceed with regard to treaties. But I think that you'll see within NATO quite a lot of interest in trying to make sure that the international cooperation that's at the heart of the Open Skies Treaty can still keep on going on. It's also an OSCE related question, of course. So, but I think the idea in general, is international organizations are venues for discussion. So we need to keep the dialogue open. We need to not react to whatever the latest kind of blip or data point is, but we need to make sure that we keep focused on how we can encourage states to keep talking. I think that's will be the main thing, following Open Skies Treaty.
Great. So the next question, what advice would you give to foreign lawyers? And I think by foreign, we mean maybe non-American, because in my office, I've got, I think, 15 different nationalities of lawyers. So everybody's a foreigner, to network and find a job in international organizations.
I think the way I got started was attending events. Now, this is obviously hard in this, well, it's kind of easier in one way because you don't have to be physically present, but it's a little harder to talk to people. But I would try to, during this period of COVID, do as many online events as you can from as diverse a kind of group of organizing institutions as you can. I think, of course, the American Society of International Law puts on interesting panels. I think you need to try to just keep up. I mean, the interesting thing about today is that there's such a huge amount of information available. You can look at so many documents of international organizations just from your own desk. On Twitter, you can follow so many people within international organization legal roles and what they're doing and what they're saying. And so use this time to do that. And on the networking, I mean, we hopefully will be able to return to a situation where people can attend more in-person events where we can actually talk. Because if there's one thing that I found is that international lawyers are quite interested in making contacts and talking to people. I think there's nothing wrong during this COVID-19 period of reaching out to people and asking if you can have a talk or have a call or something like that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And I think a lot of people will say yes.
Absolutely. I found LinkedIn actually to be very relevant. There was someone from another international organization that would basically comment or repost almost everything that I put on LinkedIn because we had a lot in common. And eventually I just reached out and I was like, hey, let's have a call, because clearly we work on some really interesting things that are very similar. And we had a great call, and now our organizations are working together on something. So it can be a really interesting platform if in-person communication is not available. Thank God for Zoom and Skype and many of these other platforms that are helping us to stay connected. All right, next question. International organizations have increasingly come under criticism for their broad immunity from liability, both civil and criminal, for their programs and employees. What do you see as the appropriate way forward for international organizations to address this issue, especially at a time when national leaders are expressing distrust and disdain for international institutions?
Yeah, I mean, one role that I tried to emphasize here was just to, in my job at NATO, was that we were living in an age of accountability. And so, just to raise, and I think that this is something that leaders of international organizations get, the idea that we're in a period of real scrutiny and also of legal accountability. And I've always felt like I was pushing at NATO on an open door when I would raise those issues. So first is just kind of put it on the agenda. And so that's one thing. Second, I would say it goes back to what I said about making your organization as fit for purpose as possible. Make sure that the policies are as up to date as possible, that you have that they're being done to the highest standard, and that they're being enforced in an equitable and kind of non-discriminatory fashion. So it's kind of, to my mind, it's kind of it's almost a leadership issue for the legal office, that you need to be an advocate for the organization, really taking accountability seriously. And I think you see that across international organizations. I would say that this is really one of the major challenges of the time, and the only way that IOs are going to be able to maintain, I think, the general immunity system that is necessary to do our work is to be as serious as possible in the way we do business and the way we deal with issues that arise, because issues are always going to arise, and just be as thorough as possible. And this goes also to the issue of the internal justice systems, to make sure that they are as strong as possible and are as judicial as possible.
Absolutely. Okay, next question. As an international organization lawyer, how easy is it to move from one IO to another? How much direct expertise in the hiring IO's work is expected? Put another way, are IO legal offices more willing than other legal employers to hire lawyers who generally understand IOs but will need on-the-job learning of their IO's specific mission and issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think that IO legal offices want to hire generalists who are knowledgeable about the legal issues that IOs face in general. I've never seen an organization that, expects you to know the mandate of you have to know the general mandate of the organization, but expects you to know every single legal issue that's going to arise, before you start working there. I don't think that's reasonable. So to answer your question, I think it's important to be, if you're already an IO lawyer, it's important to be a good IO generalist lawyer. So somebody that knows the internal justice system, that knows financial rules, that knows how to deal with these issues of accountability, how to run an internal investigation, how to deal with like a pandemic crisis, all these kind of things. If you're not yet an IO lawyer, I would say that it means that you have to emphasize those, and then make sure that you can give as much of a competency kind of spin as possible. I think I don't think it's easy to get any IO job, but I don't think it's impossible to move between IOs. In fact, you see quite a good amount. Sometimes it's a geographical movement, like I think of Vienna, OSCE, UN organizations. I mean, there's a good amount of movement amongst those. Brussels is another example where people move. Maybe NATO, EU, not so much, but within the EU institutions. So I think there's more mobility than maybe you think. And I wouldn't worry so much about it.
Yeah, and I think on the programmatic side too, we find that a lot of folks that work in my office in ODIHR often will, because we are a time-limited organization, will frequently move to OHCHR or some of the other human rights bodies to work on their programmatic issues. So certainly, I think in the same way that you would know some of the general rules and frameworks, you would know those same general rules and frameworks applied to programmatic areas, if that was the track that you were in. Okay, next question. I'm curious about the law of NATO versus the law of IOs. You mentioned that when it comes to internal policies, it's important to harmonize them with the right benchmarks. So where do you find those benchmarks? Other IOs, public international law, or elsewhere? More broadly, when formulating internal policies, to what extent do you think of NATO as a unique entity versus part of a community of international organizations?
Yeah, and I think you put your finger on, one of the issues is that, clearly, especially large international organizations have a certain sense that they're their own universe. But on the other hand, obviously, if you look at the way our, member states, they're part of all kinds of different international organizations. So they maybe you also have to look at it in terms of being part of a greater community of international organizations. How did we benchmark? It also depends kind of on the nature of your host country agreements. And so you need to look at that as well. I can say how we used to benchmark things in NATO. We certainly didn't just kind of import the local legislation. So that's one thing. And that's not meant to be knock on any of the places that host NATO facilities. That was a matter of principle, because the idea is that we were an organization that had 30 allies and was operating in a lot of different places. So we couldn't have one national law approach be, it was also a kind of a practical issue, because we have European allies versus North American allies, and they often had different approaches to things. So we couldn't just use the local legislation. We benchmarked against our kind of what we would think of as comparable international organizations. So with the UN system, you have the UN system. With organizations like NATO that aren't part of the UN, we have a kind of a loose grouping of organizations that's called the coordinated organizations. That was, a number of organizations that, as the name suggests, coordinate their policies on different issues. So we would often look to the coordinated organizations. So I know that sometimes organizations have kind of organizations that they consider to be kind of in the same sort of size, type of work, et cetera. We would often look to the United Nations, of course. So when we were in NATO, redoing our harassment policies or our policy on sexual exploitation and abuse, or many kinds of policies, we would look to the UN as the main benchmark. I would like to say that we would look to what was done in the kind of common law that might apply between all of our states, but that was often very hard to do. I think that would be the gold standard, is if you could kind of figure out what were the general principles that could be drawn from domestic law. We didn't have so many resources to be able to do that. So we would usually look to our comparables and then look at the UN, and then maybe tweak it towards the kind of military environment of NATO. Great.
There's a couple questions here that folks didn't catch the secondment reference that I made earlier. So for the OSCE, it's an organization called PAE, which handles OSCE secondments, and that's listed on the OSCE jobs website. And I'm sure that would be the case for any other or international organization that takes secondments. So I would say take a look at the jobs page. But then we've got a question here on how common are secondments from one IO to another? Are the terms and mechanics specifics to the two IOs involved, or is there a wider network or platform among IOs? Are there common or typical features across these programs, such as length, hiring process, return conditions, pay, etc.?
I don't think, however desirable it might be, it's very common. It may be more common within kind of families. So you have the UN system, and then you have, NATO has quite a number of entities that are part of the NATO system. It's more theoretically possible, but I don't think it's a very common thing. Probably should be.
Yeah, I think it'd be great. I know within the OSCE, we've got like short-term, it's kind of like staff on loan. If we've got an opening that we need someone to fill a couple of months in a position, maternity cover or a surge in workloads, we can basically borrow someone from a field office, for example, and cover their salary. But yeah, it's not a commonly used inter-IO mechanism.
Yeah, definitely not inter-IO. It's probably, hopefully that could be developed for the future.
Great idea, though. Okay. What do you think that different approaches to 5G will impact NATO as an organization? For example, if the US and most European countries will make different decisions regarding a partnership with Huawei.
Well, I mean, it's obviously a really important issue in terms of security of communications. I think that it's something that you're going to see more dialogue about between countries. There's some attempts to have some international agreements. So I think you had some principles that were issued in Prague about network security. You had some kind of NATO discussions around that, but I think it's an ongoing issue, and it's probably something that I think countries are going to have to figure out how to work together despite the different kinds of kind of domestic policy decisions that they have. And so to me, as far as NATO is concerned, that's something that we're very, the organization has really dealt with for its whole history, is different kinds of technical standards that apply in different states. And, the name of the game is how to try to figure out how to be interoperable there. And so I'm not saying that, one approach is correct or not. I know that countries have their strong views on this issue, but I think this kind of thing to me just proves why you need international organizations, why you need to actually discuss it and to share information. So if you're the United States and you have concerns about 5G, well, then use the framework, as the US does, to explain what the concerns are. And because a lot of times it's stuff that you really need to dig into to understand.
Absolutely. All right, last question, which actually has come up a couple of different times in the chat box here. Why is the NATO legal advisor a single term role, and what are your transition plans, if you can share?
Sure. Well, it's a one term. The specific contract policy for those officials is a 3+3. So it's a two terms of 3 each. I did the 2 terms of 6. And the idea there, you ask, why is that? Well, it's to it's really important for international organizations to promote mobility. Mm-hmm. And if you're asking our staff to rotate and expand their skills, you also need to ask the management to do that. And so I think it's a sign of wanting to have mobility in the senior management, and I totally support that.
Well, thank you so much for your time, and it was fascinating to hear about your experience and all the different roles that you've had over the course of your career, and certainly the different kinds of experiences that you've had in those roles. So thank you so much for all of you who have shared with us your questions and your comments. I will give a bit of a plug here for those of you who are attending the 2020 annual meeting. Please do join us for our business meeting, which should be located on the program agenda. And we certainly hope to be able to organize more of these kinds of events, whether in person or online in the future. And I guess share the recording once it's up on YouTube with your colleagues who may not have been able to join us live. So thank you again, Steve, and thanks to all of you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
And thanks to ASIL for hosting.